The flickering of candlelight dances on the walls, casting long shadows across the forgotten corners of a dimly lit scriptorium. Here, in these hushed chambers of ancient monasteries, history was not simply written but carefully crafted. Beneath the steady flow of ink on vellum, there are gaps, silent spaces, unspoken truths, and deliberate omissions. It is in these blanks, these shadows between the lines, that the most mysterious parts of the past are hidden. Imagine a time when the written word was sacred, when only a few scribes, seated by the light of flickering candles, held the power to shape what would be remembered. The world outside their stone walls pulsed with life, full of untold stories, rituals, and beliefs that were as vibrant as they were diverse. But as the quill dipped into ink and began its slow, deliberate crawl across the parchment, those stories were not always recorded. What we see today in our history books, the official narrative, is often a carefully curated selection, shaped by the hand of authority. But what lies beneath those records, in the spaces that were left empty, is where the true mystery begins. What else did medieval scribes choose times, not times to write because someone told them not to? Those who held the power to write history wielded an even greater power, the ability to shape memory itself. It wasn't just what was written, but what was erased. Whole communities, entire ways of life, vanished between the ink and parchment, wiped out as though they never existed at all. In some cases, these omissions were intentional, as certain rituals and customs were deemed too dangerous, too foreign, or too unpalatable for the ruling powers of the time. What was allowed to be chronicled was dictated by the church, by monarchs, and by those who sought to keep their own influence intact. Picture the dim, airless halls of a medieval church, its stone walls thick with secrets. In these spaces, rituals once performed by village healers or itinerant shamans were dismissed as superstition. These practices, passed down through generations, had the power to shape the lives of ordinary people in ways we can scarcely understand today. Yet, in the official chronicles, they remain absent. If they appear at all, they are reduced to little more than a footnote, a vague reference to pagan customs, misunderstood and ignored. But these gaps in the record were not always the result of neglect. Sometimes, they were carefully constructed, as if someone wanted to ensure that certain truths, perhaps too dangerous to remember, would remain forgotten. In the quiet spaces between the words, the suppressed whispers of an older world lingered. You might have caught a fleeting glimpse of them in the margins of a manuscript, where a scribe, in a moment of rebellion or curiosity, jotted down something strange, a symbol, a word, a drawing, something that had no place in the official record, but existed nonetheless, waiting for someone to notice. Take, for example, the strange symbols that often appeared in the margins of medieval texts. These weren't simply errors or the doodlings of distracted monks. They were often cryptic, mysterious, and laden with meaning. Some scholars believe these symbols were remnants of ancient, forgotten languages or codes. Others suggest they were clues, left intentionally for those with the eyes to see them. Perhaps these symbols were part of secret rituals or lost teachings, hidden by those who understood that the written word could be a tool of both illumination and deception. In the candle-lit silence of the scriptorium, the act of writing was not merely a mechanical task. It was an act of power. The scribes who worked in these shadowy chambers had a unique position at once both servant and master. They were bound to the demands of their superiors, but they also had the subtle, unspoken ability to shape the record of history. A single stroke of the quill could alter the course of understanding for centuries to come. And in those brief moments when the ink met the parchment, the power to decide what was included and what was left out was theirs. Yet, despite the power they wielded, even the scribes themselves were not always free. Some records were edited, amended, or erased entirely, as though the very act of writing had become a kind of censorship. But why? What was so dangerous about the knowledge contained within these excluded stories? What truths lay hidden in the margins of forgotten manuscripts? The more you look, the more you realize how much remains outside the bounds of what we have been told. Some records were deliberately altered or destroyed, a kind of historical cleaning that left behind only the parts of the past deemed acceptable. Stories of folk medicine, healing herbs, and spiritual practices once seen as commonplace were erased from the annals of history. Those who practiced them, shunned as witches or heretics, were buried in the same obscurity that swallowed their knowledge. But the deeper question remains: How much of the history we think we know has been shaped not just by those who wrote it, but by those who silenced it? And yet, despite these deliberate omissions, something of those lost traditions still survives. You can trace it in the quiet whispers of folklore that surface in small villages, in old songs passed down through generations, in forgotten shrines and ruins scattered across the land. These remnants suggest a world that existed outside the bounds of the official record, a world that still pulses with life beneath the surface of history. The question is no longer about what was written, but what was left out. What was buried in the silence between the records. This silence is not just a void. It is a space where forbidden knowledge waits unseen, unheard, but never truly gone. And if we are willing to listen closely enough, we may begin to hear the echoes of a past that has been deliberately concealed. A past that, for reasons unknown, someone wants to keep hidden. So, as you drift through the pages of medieval manuscripts and imagine the flicker of candlelight in those forgotten scriptoriums, ask yourself, what else has been left out of history's record? And why does it still matter today? These gaps, these silences, are more than just empty spaces. They are a part of a larger, darker mystery, one that still unfolds, hidden in plain sight, waiting to be discovered by those who dare to look beyond the surface. The medieval world, for all its grandeur and spectacle, was built upon a foundation of lives that remain largely invisible. These were the lives of common folk, whose names were never inscribed in the annals of history, and whose stories never made it into the well-kept pages of dusty manuscripts. The scribes chronicled the deeds of kings, the battles of armies, and the decrees of the powerful, but the lives of the village healers, wandering craftsmen, and farmers who tilled the earth for their daily bread were relegated to the margins. In the quiet corners of medieval life, away from the eyes of the church and the monarchy, another world thrived, one not bound by ink and parchment, but by the rhythms of the land and the unspoken traditions that flowed from one generation to the next. What secret traditions shaped everyday life for millions of medieval people, yet were never recorded? In the small, dimly lit rooms of cottages and in the shadows of the forest, a different kind of history was taking place. Here, in places outside the reach of officialdom, rituals were passed down through whispers, not written words. In the evenings, after the day's work was done, families would gather around their hearths, not to recount the victories of kings, but to speak of the strange things that had happened in the night. There were no formal records of these conversations, no official endorsement of their importance, but for those who lived them, these stories were the fabric of their lives. Consider the healer who lived at the edge of the village, away from the watchful gaze of the church. She had no title, no place in the grand chronicles of the realm, but her knowledge was far more valuable to her neighbours than any royal decree. She knew the secrets of plants, the rhythms of the seasons, and the quiet ways to mend broken bones or soothe a fevered brow. Her remedies, passed down from her grandmother, were not recorded in any text, but they were vital to the survival of the community. Yet, she remained hidden, a shadow among shadows, working in the quiet of the night to keep the fragile thread of life intact. If you asked her about her work, she would simply smile and speak of the old ways, the ones the church had long ago tried to forget. Then there were the craftsmen, who travelled from village to village, their tools worn from years of use, their hands skilled in the ancient ways. They did not write down the formulas for their crafts. They did not keep records of the intricate patterns woven into their cloth, or the secret tricks of their trade. They worked in silence, teaching their sons and daughters with a touch, a glance, and a steady hand. Their lives were not chronicled because they were not deemed important by those who controlled the written word. And yet, they were the very lifeblood of the medieval world. Without their skills, without their knowledge of how to fix the ploughs or forge the iron tools, the world would have crumbled long before the grand histories were written. The power of oral tradition shaped the everyday life of these people. In the quiet hours of the evening, when the rest of the world slept, communities gathered around fires to tell tales, some of creatures that lurked in the dark, some of spirits who wandered the fields at midnight. These stories were not merely for entertainment. They were the glue that bound the community together. They provided the structure for life itself, offering advice, warnings, and teachings that could not be found in the pages of official records. It is here, in the shared spaces of the village, in the fields and taverns and homes, that the true pulse of medieval life can be felt. The rituals, too, were woven into the fabric of these lives, Some were tied to the seasons, a reminder that life on Earth was governed by forces far beyond human control. Others were more personal, tied to the cycles of birth, death, and illness that were ever present in these communities. These rituals often took place in secret, away from the watchful eyes of the clergy, in the shadow of the church, where the official teachings of the day held no sway. At midnight, when the moon was high, villagers would whisper prayers and draw protective symbols on their doorways, hoping to ward off evil spirits. These customs were not considered important enough to be chronicled, but for those who lived by them, they were the bedrock of life. In the medieval world, the night held a special significance. It was during these hours that many of the most intimate and powerful rituals took place. The darkness, the silence, and the isolation of the night provided a space where the boundaries between the known and the unknown could blur. It was then that people felt free to turn to the old ways, to the secrets passed down from generation to generation. In the darkness, the line between superstition and wisdom was often unclear, and the things done in the quiet hours were often the most important. These secret traditions were not just about protecting oneself from spirits or ensuring a bountiful harvest. They were about survival. The rituals were closely tied to the cycles of life and death, and they provided a way to cope with the uncertainties that defined medieval existence. Life was fragile, and death was never far away. The healer's potions, the protective charms, the chants whispered in the dark, they were all ways to keep the fragile thread of life from snapping. They offered comfort in a world that was often harsh and unforgiving. And yet, despite their importance, these lives, these ordinary people, remained outside the pages of history. No king would ever praise the village healer or the wandering craftsman in his court. Their stories were not recorded in the dusty halls of monasteries, nor were they celebrated in the grand stories of medieval life. Instead, they existed in the silence between the lines, in the spaces where the ink could not reach, where the official record failed to capture the richness of life as it was truly lived. As you imagine these people, these quiet, unseen lives, remember that the official history we have inherited is incomplete. The world of the peasants, the healers, the artisans, and the nighttime workers is a world that has been lost to time, hidden in plain sight. These are the lives that didn't make it into the grand chronicles, the forgotten people whose stories were never told. They lived in the shadows, in the quiet spaces between the recorded histories, where their lives were shaped not by kings or scribes, but by the land, the seasons, and the bonds they shared with one another. The rituals and practices of these ordinary folk may never be recorded in the annals of history, but they continue to echo in the corners of our modern world. The belief in the power of symbols, the healing practices passed down through generations, the stories told by the firelight they all live on, quietly, just beneath the surface. And in the silence of those traditions, a world still waits to be discovered. For medieval people, the setting sun was more than a signal of the end of the day. It marked the beginning of another, far more dangerous world. As the last sliver of light disappeared beneath the horizon, darkness crept in, filling the air with an almost tangible weight. The land, once bathed in warmth and light, suddenly transformed into a realm of shadows, where every creak in the floorboards, every rustle in the trees, carried an echo of something unknown, something unseen. For those who lived in a world without the comforts of electricity or streetlights, nightfall wasn't merely a transition, it was a profound shift in reality. What did medieval families fear would enter their homes after the final candle went dark? As the evening approached, families took deliberate steps to prepare for the dangers they believed lurked in the dark. These weren't just precautionary actions, they were rituals, deeply ingrained in the rhythms of everyday life. The windows would be shut in a particular order, perhaps with a whispered prayer to ensure no evil spirits could slip through the cracks. Fires were kindled carefully, their flames warding off the unseen forces that the night was said to bring. The hearth became more than just a place for warmth, it was a barrier, a protective wall between the family and whatever waited outside in the darkness. But it wasn't just the physical actions that mattered. The psychological atmosphere of these rituals created a sense of vulnerability, of being on the edge of something wild and untamable. Without the reassuring glow of modern lights, the shadows in a medieval home could seem endless, stretching into corners where the eye could not follow. Each flicker of flame cast long, wavering shadows, and each gust of wind seemed to carry with it the distant whisper of something moving, something that shouldn't be there. The night was a time of heightened senses. The darkness seemed to amplify every sound, making even the most innocent creak of the floorboards feel like a warning. In this world, imagination and fear mingled freely. The tales of spirits, wandering souls, and creatures that came out only at night took root in the minds of medieval people, weaving their way into the fabric of everyday life. These weren't just stories, they were truths, passed down from generation to generation. They were the unspoken laws that governed life after dark. Inside the homes, people spoke in hushed tones, careful not to disturb the fragile barrier between them and whatever waited beyond. Certain tokens were placed in the corners of rooms, small charms, blessed herbs, or symbols meant to ward off the supernatural. At the doorways, people drew protective symbols or scattered salt, believing these simple acts would keep the forces of evil at bay. There was no space for doubt. In a world so consumed by superstition, every precaution was necessary. And every night, as the darkness fell, the rituals grew stronger, more urgent. Outside the home, the landscape itself seemed to change with the setting sun. The forests, fields, and hills were no longer just places of nature. They became the domain of the unknown. The forest, in particular, held a special place in the medieval imagination. It was both revered and feared, known for its abundance of resources, but also for the danger that lurked within its depths. At night, the boundaries between the natural world and the supernatural seemed to blur. In the dense, silent woods, it was easy to imagine creatures that weren't bound by human understanding, beasts, spirits, and ancient gods that only walked under the cover of darkness. It wasn't just the land and the home that transformed. The very atmosphere of the night seemed to carry with it an ancient power. The sky, once filled with the sun's warmth, was now dominated by the moon, a constant reminder that the night held sway over the world. People spoke of the moon with a kind of reverence, believing that its phases controlled not just the tides, but the very fabric of reality itself. As the moon climbed higher, it was said to bring forth a different kind of energy, one that stirred the spirits, awakened the creatures of the forest, and called forth the hidden forces of nature. In these moments, when the world outside grew dark and quiet, the line between what was real and what was imagined became impossibly thin. The people who lived in these villages did not see the night as a simple absence of light. They saw it as a space where anything could happen. What was hidden in the shadows wasn't just physical darkness, but a kind of unseen force, a presence that could shift the very fabric of existence. And so, each night, as the last flicker of candlelight was snuffed out, 1,000 rituals came to life, aimed at preserving the safety of the home and the soul. The rituals themselves were not always complex, but they were performed with an intensity that made them seem profound. It wasn't just about lighting a fire or closing a window. It was about keeping the world of the living separate from the world of the dead, the natural from the supernatural. Each action was imbued with meaning, each word spoken a prayer for protection. In a world so consumed by fear of the unknown, these simple acts of ritual offered a sense of control, a way to impose order on a world that seemed, at times, beyond understanding. And so, as the sun dipped below the horizon, another world began. One where the boundaries between the living and the dead, the natural and the supernatural, were no longer clear. For medieval people, nightfall wasn't just the end of the day. It was the beginning of a time when the veil between worlds was thinnest, and every step into the dark was a step into the unknown. As the world sank deeper into night, the rituals that began inside the home often spread beyond the hearth and into the heart of the community. It was here, in the darkness, that the most powerful ceremonies took place. Gatherings would form in secret, often held in places where the light of day could not reach, in the depths of forests, beside moonlit fields, or at the edges of ancient stone circles, where the earth itself seemed to pulse with ancient energy. These were not the ceremonies sanctioned by the church or the state. These were the rites of the common folk, rituals passed down from grandparent to grandchild, each one infused with the wisdom of ages. What really happened in the fields and forests when medieval villagers gathered after midnight? The medieval night, especially after the witching hour, was a liminal time. It was both revered and feared, a period in which the boundary between the natural and the supernatural could be easily crossed. The ceremonies were as much about survival as they were about spiritual belief. These were not simply social gatherings. They were acts of defiance, ceremonies meant to ensure the survival of the community during the harshest times of the year. The end of the harvest season, the long nights of winter, and the changing of the moons all called for specific observances, each one tied to the cycles of the earth and the unseen forces that governed them. As the night deepened, villagers would gather in small, tightly knit groups, often just a handful of people at a time. They would meet under the cover of darkness, careful to remain unseen by the authorities. The church, ever watchful for signs of heresy, was suspicious of these secret gatherings. The fear of being labelled a practitioner of folk magic, or worse, a witch, was ever present. Yet the rituals continued, passed down through whispers in the night. The gatherings would take many forms. Some were held in the open, around the edges of the forest, where the moonlight filtered through the trees. The ritual might involve the offering of food or drink to the spirits of the land, a simple but powerful act to ensure a good harvest in the coming year. Others were held in more secluded places, where participants would carve symbols into the earth signs meant to protect the community from harm. In the silence of the darkened fields, the rituals took on a profound power, their meaning woven deep into the fabric of the night. The ceremonies were as much about the people who gathered as they were about the rituals themselves. These were moments when the community came together, united by a shared belief in the unseen. They would chant, hum, or whisper prayers to the spirits of nature, calling on them to guide the coming seasons, protect their families, and keep the dangers of the night at bay. These rituals were not just performed for spiritual reasons. They were practical acts, meant to ensure the survival of the community. The cold, dark months of winter could be brutal, and every step taken in the night, every blessing whispered, was a way to hold back the forces that could undo them. In some places, the gatherings became more elaborate, marked by feasts meant to celebrate the end of the harvest and prepare for the trials of winter. These feasts were held in the deep night, where the warmth of food and the company of others provided a brief respite from the harshness of the world outside. And yet, even in these moments of community, there was always an undercurrent of fear. Fear of the spirits, fear of the unknown, fear of the harsh winter ahead. These midnight gatherings were not without risk. The church viewed them with suspicion, and anyone caught participating in these rites risked being accused of practicing dark magic or even heresy. The threat of punishment, of exile, or worse, hung over these meetings like a cloud. But despite the dangers, the rituals persisted, passed down through generations, keeping the ancient beliefs alive in the hearts of the people. And as the night wore on, the boundary between the natural and the supernatural seemed to blur. In the moonlit fields, in the quiet corners of the forest, it was easy to imagine that the spirits of the earth, the wind, and the stars were watching, waiting, and perhaps even participating in the ancient rites of the people. Here, in the secretive silence of the night, the power of the old ways remained alive, untouched by the passing centuries. In the half-light of a medieval cottage, with its low beams and smoke-scented walls, there existed a hidden language, one not spoken, but etched into the very bones of the home. The wooden beams, the thresholds, even the hearth itself carried subtle markings, signs of ancient belief and protection that went unnoticed by the untrained eye. To outsiders, these might have seemed like insignificant scratches or smudges of dirt. But for the families who lived in these homes, each mark held a purpose far beyond mere decoration. What secret messages did medieval families carve into their walls to keep danger away? In every corner of the house, a silent code was in place. Chalk marks on doorframes, carved symbols hidden beneath the floorboards, and even the arrangement of furniture all served to protect the family within. These symbols weren't made for beauty or artistic expression. They were protective, intended to guard against misfortune, malevolent spirits, or anything that might disrupt the peace of the home. The marks were often small, easily overlooked by the unfamiliar. A faint line etched along the edge of a beam, a circle drawn with chalk on a doorframe, or a token tucked into a wall's crevice, each carried a specific meaning. Some were designed to confuse wandering spirits, sending them down paths that led them far away from the warmth and safety of the family. Others invited blessings into the home, prosperity, health, and the protection of loved ones. The shapes were often geometric circles, crosses, triangles, even spirals, symbols that carried centuries of belief, long before Christianity had woven its influence into the fabric of society. These markings were not confined to walls alone. In some homes, protective charms were buried beneath the floorboards or tucked away in the cracks of the foundation. It was believed that the earth itself had the power to absorb negative energy, and so the practice of hiding objects for protection was common. A small pouch of herbs, an old coin, or a wooden talisman each had its place, offering spiritual and physical defense. Families would sometimes bury these charms during moments of particular vulnerability, a new birth, a wedding, or a journey into the unknown. These acts were often done in private, with only close family members present, out of fear that neighbours or clergy might discover the practices and disapprove. The language of these markings was ancient, predating the rise of Christianity in Europe. Many of these symbols and rituals had been passed down from earlier pagan traditions, a legacy that slowly blended with the newer Christian worldview. Pagan gods, spirits of the earth, and protectors of the hearth had been replaced with saints, angels, and the divine protection of Christ. But the symbols and the need for protection remained. They were woven into the very fabric of daily life, so ingrained that they became second nature. These small, private rituals, performed quietly at dawn or just after supper, formed a barrier between the mundane world and the unknown. As dusk fell and shadows lengthened, families knew the dangers that lurked beyond the safety of their walls. The night time was a time when unseen forces could cross into the realm of the living. The ritual of marking their space was, in a way, a claim of ownership. This home, this hearth, was theirs to protect, and the marks on the walls were a constant reminder of that. Whether it was a symbol to protect the family from sickness, or a charm to safeguard the livestock from the wolves that roamed the outskirts of the village, these small acts gave medieval people the illusion of control in a world that often seemed beyond their understanding. The rituals varied from region to region, but they all shared the same underlying principle: survival. Protection wasn't just about keeping physical danger away, it was also about maintaining spiritual balance. The world of the medieval peasants was one where the line between the natural and supernatural was often indistinct. It wasn't just a matter of watching for predators in the woods, it was also a matter of ensuring that malevolent forces didn't find their way into the home. And so, each mark, each symbol, each hidden charm, carried with it the weight of belief and the hope of safety. This hidden language of the home was not for anyone to see. It was for the family, the small, tight-knit group that lived in the shadows of the village, far from the grand cathedrals and the watchful eyes of the clergy. These rituals were not meant to be shared with outsiders. The beliefs that underpinned them were too private, too sacred to be exposed to the judgment of those who did not understand. And so, they remained hidden, tucked away in the corners of homes, leaving behind a trail of symbols that continue to speak across time, even though the world they protected has long since faded away. As much as the physical markings within the home held protective power, it was the soft, spoken rituals, the whispers, chants, and breath rituals that formed the very heartbeat of medieval spiritual life. These were the rituals that, unlike the carved symbols, were never seen by outsiders. They existed in the spaces between words, in the quiet murmur of a mother's voice over her sleeping child, in the steady rhythm of breath taken in time with a prayer, or in the soft chant whispered by a traveller before crossing a dangerous forest. These rituals were more intimate, more personal. They were woven into the very fabric of daily survival, and yet they left no trace on the physical world. What soft words did medieval people whisper into the dark to keep fear away? In the quiet moments before sleep, mothers would murmur protective chants over their children, voices low and soothing, designed to ward off nightmares, illness, or evil spirits. These words were more than just comfort, they were a protective shield, an act of spiritual defense that carried weight in the unseen world. The chants, often passed down through generations, were spoken in a language that transcended mere words. The rhythm of the chant, the cadence of the breath, all worked together to create a force that could keep the dangers of the night at bay. Each incantation had a purpose: to ensure a child's safety, to invoke blessings for good health, or to protect the soul from wandering spirits. Travellers, too, carried their whispered rituals with them. Before setting foot into the darkened forest, a place of both danger and wonder, they would mutter protective charms. The woods were not just a physical space, they were an intersection between the natural world and the supernatural. Ancient beings, spirits, and forces that had no place in the day's world were said to dwell there. To enter the forest without a protective word, a charm spoken into the air, was to risk losing oneself to those unseen forces. And so, The travelers would chant, breathing out words of protection, words that tied them to the land and the spirits that guarded it. On farms, the rituals were woven into the rhythms of labor. As farmers tilled the soil or tended to their flocks, they would hum softly or whisper small prayers to the earth, calling on it to yield its bounty. These chants were not grand acts of worship. They were intimate, whispered in the quiet solitude of the fields. The breath was key, deep, steady, rhythmic, as the laborers aligned their bodies with the work and the spiritual energy of the land. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible ritual, but one that was deeply embedded in the practices of survival. And yet, despite their profound significance, these whispered rituals were condemned by many. The Church, ever vigilant for signs of heresy, sought to suppress these practices, dismissing them as pagan superstitions or, worse, dark magic. They were quiet acts, performed away from the eyes of the clergy, and so they persisted. The people continued to breathe their prayers, to chant their incantations, knowing that these rituals answered a deep, unspoken need. They didn't need to be written down or formalized. They lived in the breath of everyday life, a language of protection passed from one person to another, unspoken but always understood. In these rituals, the medieval world revealed its most intimate secrets. They were not grand ceremonies with elaborate rites and prayers. Instead, they were small, quiet moments of connection, moments when people whispered into the dark, trusting that the words, the breath, would hold the power to keep them safe. And though these rituals left no physical trace, they remain a testament to the enduring human need to find meaning in the world's most hidden corners. In the medieval world, the forest was never just a collection of trees. It was a living, breathing entity, a vast, mysterious expanse full of ancient energy. It held moods, it had rules, and, most importantly, it remembered. For the villagers who lived on its edge, the forest was a place both revered and feared, where nature and the supernatural intertwined. What ancient rules did medieval villagers follow before stepping foot into the forest? Before venturing into the woods, villagers would stop at the threshold, the edge of the forest where the trees seemed to breathe. They didn't just walk in, as they might stroll through a meadow. They approached the forest with a deep, quiet reverence. There were paths marked by age-old tradition, some well-trodden and safe, others darkened by superstition and caution. These were the paths that families walked, the routes passed down from elders to children, each step a quiet negotiation with the land itself. And while the forest was a source of resources, wood for fire, herbs for healing, animals for hunting, it was also a place of spirit. The air seemed heavier here, as if the trees held memories of all who had ever passed beneath their canopy. The villagers knew the forest could be unpredictable. Certain trees were sacred. Ancient oaks, for example, were treated with particular care. People would leave offerings at their roots, a handful of bread, a few wild flowers, or small wooden figurines carved with loving hands. These were gifts, tokens of respect to the forest spirits that were thought to inhabit the trees. To harm an oak, or any tree held in such reverence, was to risk angering the spirits that protected the land. Children, too, were taught early to respect the forest's boundaries. When walking through the woods, they would follow older relatives closely, sticking to the safe paths that, by tradition, had never been deviated from. To wander too far or stray from the known routes could lead to disaster. The forest was a place where the rules of human life bent and twisted, where the wildness of nature could overpower the will of men. It was a place where spirits roamed freely, and where the unseen and unknown were as real as the world they could touch. Hunters, who knew the forest like the back of their hands, still left tokens on tree stumps, small carvings or twigs arranged in particular patterns. These small signs were not just markers, they were acts of respect, acknowledging the delicate balance between the hunter and the hunted. To take too much from the forest without giving back was to upset that balance, and the forest had a way of punishing those who took more than their share. The spirits of the woods, it was said, had long memories, and they would remember those who treated the land with care, as well as those who trespassed thoughtlessly. The forest was both protective and terrifying. It was a place where the unseen could be heard, and the unimaginable could take form. There were creatures here, both real and mythic, that could take a wrong turn, or misstep from a villager, and turn it into something far worse than a simple misadventure. Wolves were a common fear, but so were spirits, ghosts of those who had wandered too far or been lost to the forest's depths. Every whisper of wind, every snap of twig underfoot, could be seen as a message from the forest itself. The unknown seemed to gather in the spaces between the trees, making the forest a place where every footfall felt laden with consequence. As night began to fall, the woods transformed once again. The air grew colder, the shadows lengthened, and the world of men began to dissolve into the mysterious world of spirits. At dusk, when the sun's last light barely touched the horizon, villagers who needed to pass through the woods would quicken their pace. It was a time when the veil between the living and the unseen grew thin. And yet, it wasn't just superstition. People truly believed that the woods were alive, that they contained forces beyond human understanding. To walk through the forest at night was to be in communion with something much older than human civilization itself, a force that was neither good nor evil but beyond both. This was the world of the medieval forest, a place of ancient power, of spirits, rituals, and respect. It was a space where the rules were passed down, not in books or written scrolls, but through stories told by firelight, whispered through generations. The forest was a part of life, and those who treated it with respect would find it to be a protector. But those who dared to break its unspoken laws would pay the price, sometimes with misfortune, sometimes with fear, and sometimes with far more. In the end, the forest was never just a resource, it was a living, breathing force that connected the land and the people in a delicate dance of give and take. As the wheel of the year turned, the medieval villagers understood that each season carried with it a new set of challenges and blessings. The changing of the seasons wasn't just a natural occurrence, it was a sacred threshold, a moment when the very fabric of reality seemed to shift. To medieval people, these changes were moments to mark and honor, as the seasons themselves were seen as gateways between worlds, each with its own rituals of renewal, protection, and celebration. What forgotten ceremonies once guided medieval people through the turning of each season? The year began with the promise of rebirth. The spring, when the earth stretched awake from its winter slumber. Springtime rituals were meant to purify and prepare the land for the new cycle. Villagers would gather early in the morning, their breath rising in clouds of mist as they carried bundles of fresh herbs to the fields. They would paint protective symbols on their tools, hoping that the harvest would be plentiful and free from disease. At the crossroads, where paths met and paths parted, they would leave small offerings, a coin, a small piece of bread, a flower. These were not just gestures, they were prayers for good fortune, a way to ensure that the earth would yield its bounty without hardship. As the days grew longer and the sun reached its highest point, the summer solstice marked another key ritual, the celebration of the longest day. Bonfires would be lit, and people would gather around them, dancing and singing into the night, celebrating the abundance of the earth and the power of the sun. But it wasn't all joy. The summer solstice was also a time to prepare for the harshness of the coming months. It was a time when the elders would gather the community and share stories, passing down knowledge of how to survive the unpredictable storms and droughts of summer. Then, as the first cool winds of autumn began to blow, the harvest festival became a moment of thanksgiving, but also of vigilance. Villagers would gather in circles around the fields, offering a prayer to the earth for its generosity, and ensuring that the harvest would last through the cold months. Some communities held feasts, where the last of the crops was celebrated in song, the food prepared with both reverence and gratitude. But there were also darker rites performed under the pale moonlight rituals to protect the harvest from thieves, spirits, and illness. And then came winter, the final season of the year. Winter was a time of survival, but it was also a time to honor the past. As the cold gripped the land and the nights grew long, villagers would gather in the warmth of their homes, telling stories of ancestors long gone. These stories weren't just for comfort, they were rituals of remembrance, ways to ensure that the spirits of those who had passed remained with them through the cold. At the heart of these winter gatherings was a deep, quiet understanding that winter was a time of rest, but also of preparation. The rituals performed in the dead of winter were a way of securing the village's survival through the months ahead. Each of these seasonal transitions, the solstice fires, the harvest end ceremonies, the purification rites of spring, were not simply rituals for the sake of tradition. They were ways of anchoring the community to something larger than themselves, tying their survival to the rhythms of nature and the cosmos. These were the gateways through which the people passed, not just to mark the passage of time but to ensure their place in the natural world. Each ceremony, each ritual, was an attempt to control the uncontrollable, to hold nature's capriciousness at bay, to ensure that the earth would continue to turn in their favour. The medieval calendar was full of these moments, these sacred thresholds where the passage of time was celebrated and feared in equal measure. Each season brought with it new opportunities and dangers, and each transition was marked by rituals designed to help people survive the wild unpredictability of nature. And while some of these ceremonies have been lost to time, their echoes still resound, reminding us that the cycles of life and death, abundance and famine, have always shaped human existence. In the quiet, early hours of the morning, before the first rays of sunlight broke the horizon, the forest edges would stir with activity. The air, still thin from the lingering night, seemed to carry a quiet magic, an openness, as if the world itself was ready to listen. It was at this time that the herb keepers, those ancient healers who existed at the margins of society, would venture out. They were figures both respected and feared, their knowledge of plants and remedies passed down through whispered generations, never written, always protected by silence. What hidden plant rituals did medieval healers use long before modern medicine existed? These women, and sometimes men, moved through the underbrush with the surety of long practice. They didn't just gather herbs, they spoke to them, acknowledging their power, understanding the delicate balance between the plant and the person it would heal. The leaves, roots, and flowers they collected weren't simply ingredients. They were the very foundation of a healing process that blended observation, intuition, and ancient knowledge. Each plant held its own mystery, its own lesson. Sage for purification, rosemary for remembrance, willow for pain relief. These plants weren't just remedies. They were part of a language, a code passed down like a treasure through time. In their small huts, nestled away from prying eyes, these healers would prepare their potions. The air would be thick with the scent of dried herbs, the clink of glass bottles, and the quiet murmur of incantations. Many of these rituals involved more than just mixing ingredients. A bowl of water might be passed over a patient's body, with soft chanting filling the room, the healer's voice rising and falling like a prayer. Sometimes herbs were placed beneath pillows to ensure restful sleep, or protective circles were drawn around the sick, as if to create a space where the forces of illness couldn't intrude. These practices were not documented, at least, not in any formal way. The healers understood the dangers of being seen. The church and its clergy were always watchful for signs of heresy or witchcraft, and those who practiced outside the accepted norms risked punishment, even execution. So these healers operated in the shadows, their knowledge passed along in secret, from mother to daughter, from one trusted friend to another. Despite the secrecy, their work was invaluable. When the village was struck with illness, whether from a seasonal plague or an injury in the fields, it was often these healers who provided the only remedy. The physician who might visit the rich could not always be counted on to provide the same care for the poor, but the herb keeper, with her careful potions and whispered rituals, was a lifeline. She understood that healing wasn't just about curing the body, it was about understanding the spirit too. Sometimes, a person who was gravely ill needed more than just a tincture of roots. They needed a moment of peace, a connection with something beyond themselves. The blending of practical healing with deep spiritual belief created a powerful framework for these medieval healers. They understood the emotional undercurrents of illness, the fear of death, the pain of suffering, and the deep hope for recovery. They could be found beside sickbeds, not just offering medicine, but offering comfort using touch, quiet words, and ritual. In these moments, the boundaries between the physical world and the world of the unseen blurred. The herbs worked, but so too did the belief in them, the belief that someone cared enough to help and that the forces of nature could still be called upon to heal. While the healers worked to restore the body to health, there was another realm of folk medicine that dealt not with physical injury, but with unseen forces. In a world steeped in superstition, illness was not always seen as a natural occurrence. Sometimes, misfortune was believed to be caused not by the whims of nature, but by the ill will of another. Curses were a real fear, something medieval villagers believed could be wielded by those with malicious intent. Jealousy, social tension, or personal grudges could manifest as sickness, misfortune, or even death. What hidden rituals did medieval families perform when they believed someone had cursed them? These were the darker, more secretive rituals, the counterspells, the protective wards. The rites meant not to heal, but to protect and to undo harm. When a family suspected that they had been cursed, whether from a rival, a jealous neighbor, or an envious stranger, they would turn to these rites to restore balance. The fear that something unseen had the power to reach into their lives, to twist their fate, was powerful enough to prompt desperate action. At night, when the world was quiet and the mind most susceptible to fear, families might perform quiet rituals, hoping to undo the curse that was believed to hover over them. These rituals weren't loud or dramatic. They were subtle, intimate, and often done under the cover of darkness. Bowls of salt might be placed beneath the sickbed, as salt was believed to purify and protect against negative energies. Sometimes herbs would be burned, their smoke rising to cleanse the air and drive away the malevolent forces. The smoke of sage or juniper was used to purify, to remove the lingering influence of a curse that might be poisoning the very air around them. Other times, people would arrange stones in particular patterns, sometimes in a circle, other times in a line, believing that the shape itself held the power to contain the curse. These rituals were never formalized. They weren't part of an established tradition that could be written down in books. They were passed along by word of mouth, taught in whispers, in the corners of kitchens, in the silence of twilight. These were the rituals of ordinary people, desperate to restore some form of control in a world that often felt governed by unseen forces. The counterspells weren't just about the physical objects used, they were about the emotion behind them. These rituals were as much about belief as they were about action. The process of performing the ritual of creating a boundary, of setting a trap for the evil force, provided a sense of agency in a world where so much was unpredictable and out of one's control. The act of taking matters into their own hands, of trying to reverse the curse, was as important as the rituals themselves. And while these acts were often done in secret, the emotional stakes were incredibly high. A curse was seen as something that could undo the very fabric of a family's life. Health, happiness, and prosperity could all be lost to the whims of a jealous neighbor or a bitter enemy. In this world, where death and illness were ever present, the belief in curses was a constant companion. The only way to fight back, to regain some measure of safety, was through these quiet, hidden rituals. These rituals weren't always successful, of course. The forces at play were seen as powerful, sometimes beyond the reach of even the most devoted counterspells. But the act of believing in them, of performing the rituals with conviction, was enough to offer some comfort. It was a way to combat the helplessness that comes with being vulnerable in a world that was often unpredictable, cruel, and full of unseen dangers. The rituals tied to curses and counterspells reveal a deep human need for control, a desire to push back against forces that felt insurmountable. In a world so governed by superstition, belief itself was a force to be reckoned with, a force that, at least for a time, could offer protection against the unseen evils that lurked in the corners of everyday life. In the quiet moments after the birth of a child, long before the priest arrived with holy water, the family began their own rituals, small, intimate acts woven with ancient belief. The room, lit only by the soft glow of a candle and the muted warmth of a hearth, felt full of fragile promises. The world of the infant was delicate, fragile, and the community knew that the first rituals of life were meant to protect and nurture this new soul, to give it roots in a world where survival was far from guaranteed. What unseen rituals welcomed a child into the medieval world before any priest arrived? Midwives, those ancient guides of life, would carry with them more than just practical knowledge. They carried the weight of tradition, an understanding of how the fragile new life needed to be held, protected, and blessed. While the church was often the final authority on matters of birth and baptism, there were private, quiet customs that took place in the shadows of the home. A coin might be placed beneath the cradle, for luck and prosperity. A piece of bread, perhaps, or a charm crafted from natural materials, hidden away where only the newborn could feel it. These tokens were meant to protect the child from the unseen forces that threatened the fragile threshold between life and death. The name of the child was chosen with great care, sometimes whispered into the air by a mother, sometimes decided after a dream or a vision, or in connection with an ancient family memory. Names were not simply labels, but vessels of meaning, carrying the weight of ancestry, of survival, and of the promise of the future. A name chosen in reverence to an elder who had passed on could offer a sense of continuity, an assurance that the child's place in the family and in the community was secured. In the dim light of the home, midwives and mothers would often turn to words too, whispering soft incantations over the child's body, murmuring protective phrases as they carefully wrapped the infant in swaddling cloth. These words, spoken in gentle tones, formed a boundary, a quiet spell woven from generations of women who had known that life, in the Middle Ages, was not guaranteed. Every blessing, every word of protection, was a prayer to keep death at bay for just a little longer, to allow the fragile child to thrive. These early rituals, often performed in the silence between family members, were essential to the baby's survival. Children were viewed as fragile, and in the medieval world, life was precarious. The rituals performed in the hours and days following birth were not merely symbolic. They were practical measures, ways to ensure that the new life would be supported by the full power of the family, the land, and the unseen world of spirits. The importance of these rituals can be felt in the physicality of the actions. Midwives did not just deliver babies, they carried the weight of ancestral knowledge. The oils used to anoint a newborn's skin, the herbs placed beneath the cradle, the simple acts of naming and blessing each carried the power of protection. To name a child was to claim them in the world, to give them a place in the fabric of life, and perhaps to speak their safety into being. Marriage, in the medieval world, was more than just a formal union between two individuals. It was a sacred contract, a bond between families, a promise to the community, and, perhaps, a necessary act of survival. The church, with its formal ceremonies and blessings, was one part of the story. But there were other rituals, quieter ones, that spoke directly to the heart of the union, ones that took place in the spaces between vows and feasts. What forgotten vows did medieval couples exchange in secret, long before public ceremonies began? Before the grand celebrations and the public declarations of love, many couples took part in private rituals that were steeped in ancient customs. These practices, passed down from one generation to the next, were as much about emotional connection as they were about practical survival. Trust, after all, was at the core of any successful marriage, especially in a time when survival itself depended on cooperation, hard work, and mutual support. In the dim glow of the hearth, far away from the watchful eyes of the clergy, couples might exchange vows not before a priest, but in the presence of their families, a sacred circle that understood the true importance of the bond being formed. A simple yet powerful gesture was often used, the binding of hands with a cord, a symbolic act that physically and spiritually joined the couple. The entwining of hands, bound by a single thread, was a powerful symbol of commitment, of unity in the face of a world that often felt as though it could tear even the strongest bonds apart. These rites were not for public display. They were not to be recorded in a formal ledger or celebrated in the church. They were personal, intimate, a way of speaking promises without the need for words. These vows weren't just spoken, they were felt in the very act of coming together, in the exchange of tokens meant to protect the union. A hand-carved ring, a lock of hair tied with a ribbon, an item of deep personal significance. These small, humble tokens were exchanged with the knowledge that their value lay in their meaning, not their material worth. Elders would often be present during these private rituals, offering quiet guidance and blessings. The older generation, with their own knowledge of the fragile balance between life and death, often imparted wisdom about what it meant to join two lives together. It was understood that marriage was not just about love, it was about survival. The couple would work the land together, raise children, and face the trials of life side by side. And in a world where hardship was constant, the rituals that marked the union were meant to ensure that the bond was strong enough to weather any storm. In some regions, couples might even make promises to one another, through shared labor, working side by side to plant a tree or build a home, as a physical representation of their commitment. These acts, though simple, were deeply symbolic. They showed that the bond between them was grounded in action, in shared work and effort. The creation of something together was a way of establishing the foundation of the marriage, a foundation that would not only support the couple, but also the community around them. Even the act of living together was part of the ritual. The home itself, once shared, became a living symbol of the marriage. The hearth, the table, the garden, every part of the domestic space was woven into the fabric of the relationship. Each meal shared, each stone in the foundation of their home, Each field they worked together was a part of the ritual, a deeper, unspoken acknowledgement that their union was sacred and vital. These rituals, performed quietly and without fanfare, remind us that the bonds of marriage in the medieval world were not just based on romantic love, but on a deeply rooted sense of duty, trust, and survival. The vows exchanged in secret, the acts of labor, the humble tokens of protection, these were the true foundations of the medieval union, marking not just a personal commitment, but a shared promise to face the world, with all its challenges, as one. This section, with its intimate portrayal of both birth and marriage rituals, moves the audience through personal rites that form the heart of medieval identity. These traditions, hidden and often unrecorded, reveal a world deeply connected to the emotional, spiritual, and practical needs of everyday life. From the earliest moments of life to the bonds of marriage, the rites of passage shape the very structure of the medieval family and community. The next chapter will delve into the rituals tied to death, memory, and the end of life, completing the circle of human experience. In the stillness that followed death, before the body was laid to rest, there existed a quiet, profound ritual of passage, one that guided the soul on its journey to the beyond. For medieval families, death wasn't just an end, it was the beginning of a journey, one that required care, respect, and, above all, a series of rituals designed to protect both the living and the dead. These customs, practiced in the shadows of official rites, were meant to ensure that the soul would pass safely into the afterlife, and that the spirit would not linger, bound by earthly concerns. What secret rites guided a medieval soul through the unseen path beyond death? In the hours following death, as the body lay still in the home, family members performed symbolic gestures that reflected a belief that the soul's journey was not instantaneous. The deceased's eyes would often be closed, and mirrors in the home covered, as it was believed that the spirit might become trapped by its reflection, unable to move on. The body itself would be treated with great reverence, cleaned, anointed, and dressed. But it was the subtler rituals, those performed in quiet spaces, that truly marked the soul's transition. Herbs were often placed around the body, not just to mask the smell of decay, but to guide the spirit. Lavender, rosemary, and thyme herbs, known for their protective properties, were thought to help clear the path between this world and the next. Sometimes, these herbs were carefully arranged in specific patterns around the body or laid in the corners of the room. Knots were tied into strings or cloth, often placed around the deceased's hands or around doorways, as they were believed to bind evil spirits and prevent them from entering the space. These small acts, so seemingly insignificant, were rooted in an ancient belief that death was a door, and like any door, it needed to be carefully opened, with protection to keep unwanted forces at bay. The family would often keep a vigil over the body, lighting candles or lamps in a dark room, their flames flickering in the quiet night. During this time, the family would gather close, sometimes singing softly or chanting quiet prayers, invoking divine protection for the departed soul. These moments of silence and song were as much for the living as they were for the dead, a way to honor the passage, to come to terms with the inevitable, and to seek solace in a world that offered little comfort. While priests might later come to perform the rites of burial, it was the family who first prepared the soul's journey. They were the first to create the boundary between life and death, to guide the spirit through familiar spaces, the home, the hearth, the land that had witnessed the deceased's life. Every act, from the placement of a protective charm to the careful folding of burial shrouds, was meant to ensure that the soul would not wander, lost in the space between worlds. The soul, believed to linger for a time in the place it had once inhabited, needed guidance. These small, private rituals were meant to guide it through the threshold. Death was a mystery, and in its wake, so many unknowns remained. The rituals surrounding it helped bring structure to the fear and grief that followed. For the living, these customs offered a sense of agency in a world where so much was uncontrollable. The rituals offered comfort, belief, and the possibility of peace for both the living and the dead. Once the body was laid to rest and the immediate mourning passed, the memory of the deceased did not simply fade into the past. For medieval families, the dead were never truly gone. They lived on in whispered memories, in small rituals, and in the spaces where their spirits were believed to dwell. These customs, often unseen by outsiders, were deeply woven into the fabric of everyday life, ensuring that the departed remained a part of the community's life, not as a ghost or a lingering spirit, but as an enduring presence. What quiet traditions kept medieval ancestors close to their families long after burial? Each year, on specific nights, families would light candles, placing them in windows to guide the souls of their ancestors home. These candles were not just light, they were beacons, meant to call the dead back for a brief moment, to allow them to pass through the veil and visit the living. These private rites of remembrance weren't grand affairs, they didn't require a church or a large gathering, but they were essential to the family, to the village, to the understanding that the deceased were still with them in some small way. At the hearth, families would quietly speak the names of those who had passed. Stories would be told, memories would be shared, not in grand memorials, but in these subtle moments. An old father, perhaps, would speak of the deeds of his father or his grandfather, his voice filled with reverence for the departed. These were not just tales of times gone by, they were ways of ensuring that the departed remained part of the living community. The dead lived through their stories, through the retelling of their actions, their triumphs, and even their flaws. Sometimes, families would leave offerings at thresholds or beside the family hearth, small tokens like a loaf of bread, a drink of wine, or a sprig of rosemary. These offerings were meant to show that the family was still mindful of the departed, still connected, still caring for them as they once did in life. These offerings weren't for the church or for any public ritual. They were personal, private acts of remembrance, steeped in a love that had never quite faded. In rural areas, it wasn't unusual for families to keep small tokens wrapped in cloth, perhaps a ring, a piece of clothing, or a trinket once owned by the deceased. These objects were often stored in a special place, as though the family was holding onto a piece of the person, a physical representation of their continued existence within the home. The sight of such items, touched by the hands of those who had passed, carried a deep emotional significance, reminding the living of the connection that never truly ended. These rituals, so subtle and personal, spoke volumes about how death was understood in medieval communities. The dead were not simply mourned and buried, they were woven into the fabric of daily life, brought out in quiet moments of remembrance, of honouring, of keeping the memory alive. It was a way of living with death, not as an ending, but as a continuation of the bond between the living and the departed. Through these practices, the dead were kept close. They became a part of the cycle of life, not as spirits haunting the living, but as ancestors whose presence was felt in the daily routines, in the quiet actions of remembrance. These customs reminded the living that death was not the final separation. It was simply another stage in the ongoing relationship between the past and the present, between memory and reality. As families gathered around the hearth, as they whispered names and lit candles in the night, they were participating in a cycle that had been passed down through generations. And in this quiet, intimate ritual of remembrance, the medieval world was connected not just to the past, but to something far deeper, something timeless. Through memory, the dead lived on, and through these rituals, the living maintained their connection to them, keeping the bond between life and death alive for generations to come. In this chapter, the rituals surrounding death, mourning, and remembrance serve to illustrate how medieval communities coped with one of life's greatest mysteries. Through secret rites and quiet acts of devotion, the dead were never truly gone. They remained with the living, not as ghosts, but as enduring memories that shaped daily existence. The following chapter will continue this exploration, moving from the deeply personal rituals of life and death to the collective practices that bound entire communities together. The long, dark nights of the medieval world were filled with fire, both literal and symbolic. As the seasons shifted and festivals came around, communities gathered to embrace the power of light. Fire was not only a practical necessity, it was a potent symbol of purification, protection, and unity. The festivals that once marked the turning of the year, the harvest, or the arrival of the solstices, were illuminated by flame, by the flickering torchlight that lined the streets, by the roaring bonfires that served as beacons to guide people through the darkness, both physical and spiritual. What ancient fire festivals once lit entire villages, and why did they vanish? The air would be thick with the crackling sound of burning wood, the pungent scent of burning resin and smoke, and the deep, rhythmic chants that echoed through the streets. These fire festivals weren't mere celebrations, they were rites meant to banish evil, to purify the community, and to invoke blessings for the future. The processions were often torchlit, the streets alive with movement as villagers walked in solemn rhythm, each flame a reminder of both the warmth and danger that fire could bring. Some ceremonies included the ritualistic burning of objects, perhaps old clothing or symbolic representations of past troubles. It was believed that by casting these things into the flames, the community could release its burdens, purify itself, and step into a new season with a fresh start. In some villages, the highlight of the celebration was fire leaping, a daring, symbolic act in which people, often young men and women, would leap over bonfires. It was believed that this act could cleanse them of bad luck, misfortune, and illness, marking a new chapter in their lives. The roaring flames cast long shadows, creating a sense of the sacred, of crossing over to the other side, and the entire village would watch in awe, joining together in collective fear and joy. These festivals weren't just celebrations of light, they were moments of collective facing of the unknown. Fire had a dual nature. It could protect and destroy. The act of gathering around it, of dancing in its glow, was a communal acknowledgement that life was fragile and full of mystery. As the flames leapt into the sky, they symbolized the burning away of uncertainty, the banishment of fear. But over time, these powerful celebrations faded. Religious and political pressures, combined with a growing mistrust of pagan practices, pushed these ancient fire festivals out of the public eye. As Christianity gained ground across medieval Europe, festivals that had once honored the cycles of nature and the elements were recast as dangerous or even heretical. What had once been joyous, collective acts of purification became quietly suppressed, forced into the shadows or, in many cases, completely erased from the communal calendar. And yet, even as these festivals disappeared from the official records, traces of them lingered. Small, hidden rituals, passed down in whispers, survived in the corners of rural communities. The fire festivals may have been officially extinguished, but their spirits of unity, cleansing, and joy carried on in the collective memory, flickering in the minds of those who remembered. While fire lit the nights, it was the warmth of communal feasts, the songs, and the shared stories that built the social fabric of medieval life. The hearth became the center of the home, and the table became the heart of the community. These gatherings, often centered around seasonal harvests, weddings, or religious observances, formed the backbone of social life. They were times of connection, where the bonds of kinship and friendship were strengthened, and where cultural memory was preserved not in dusty scrolls, but in the voices of those gathered together. What forgotten songs and feasting customs once bound medieval communities together? At the long tables set with bread, broth, and a variety of locally grown foods, people came together to celebrate life in all its forms. These feasts weren't just about food, they were about community, about strengthening the ties that bound people together. As the bread was broken and the wine passed, there was more than just sustenance in the air. There was a shared understanding that, in a world so often marked by uncertainty and danger, these moments of unity were precious and essential. The food they shared wasn't just a meal, it was a ritual of belonging, a symbolic act that reminded everyone present of their role in the larger community. Music played a vital role in these gatherings. Simple instruments, flutes, fiddles, lutes, accompanied the laughter and conversations that filled the air. The sound of music was like a living thread, weaving people together across generations. Songs passed down through families and villages carried more than just melody, they carried history. These were songs that told stories, songs that recalled times of hardship and triumph, of battles won and seasons of famine. The songs were not merely for entertainment, they were the lifeblood of memory, connecting the present with the past in ways that no written document could. Elders, revered for their wisdom and experience, would often take the lead in these gatherings. They told the stories of their ancestors, recounting not just history, but the lessons learned from it. These tales were more than entertainment, they were a way of transmitting cultural values and shared experiences, ensuring that the younger generation would understand the importance of their history and identity. In the warmth of the firelight, with the scent of roasted meat and freshly baked bread in the air, the stories took on a life of their own, becoming a living part of the community's memory. But these rituals weren't only about the spoken or sung word, they were also about the silence between them. The pauses during a feast, the quiet moments after the songs had ended, were filled with unspoken understanding. The shared experience of a meal, the collective act of sitting together as equals, transcended the words that were spoken. These rituals reinforced the importance of belonging, of knowing one's place in the social order. Feasts and storytelling were also the foundation of the medieval calendar. These gatherings, steeped in ritual, marked the passage of time in ways that were both practical and spiritual. As the seasons shifted, so did the nature of the meals and the songs. The harvest festivals were a time of thanksgiving for the abundance of the land, while the winter solstice feasts were a time of light and warmth, celebrating survival through the long, dark months. These social rituals created a sense of continuity, a reminder that, no matter what happened in the world outside, the community could endure as long as it kept the traditions alive. Over time, however, these intimate gatherings began to lose their central role in society. The rise of the church and the growth of centralized power shifted many of these rituals into more formalized public events. But even as feasts and songs became more regulated and less personal, the core of what they represented, community, belonging, and the preservation of cultural identity, remained. The private meals and quiet songs may have faded from the official records, but the sense of connection they fostered lived on in the collective memory of the people. As we reflect on these moments of communal unity, we are reminded of a world where rituals were not just about ceremony, but about survival. These traditions helped medieval people navigate a world of uncertainty and danger, where the bonds of community were essential for both emotional and physical well-being. From the roaring fires that once marked the rhythm of the year to the quiet gatherings around tables of bread and song, the medieval world was shaped by rituals that bound people together. These celebrations, whether joyous or solemn, created a shared sense of identity and belonging. In the next chapter, we will explore the secretive and often forbidden practices that survived in the shadows of these official rituals, revealing a hidden world of beliefs that still shaped medieval life. In the medieval world, not all traditions were accepted. While the church and political authorities worked to consolidate power, many ancient rituals, steeped in pre-Christian beliefs, were seen as a threat. These practices were not just dismissed, they were actively suppressed, erased, and forgotten. The powerful forces of religion and politics moved to control not only the land, but also the hearts and minds of the people, and the rituals that connected them to the old world were viewed as dangerous. What practices were so important to medieval people that authorities tried to erase them forever? It is difficult to imagine a time when something as simple as a dance or a symbol could be deemed dangerous. And yet, certain rituals were so ingrained in the lives of ordinary people that they were worth fighting for, even when the authorities tried to destroy them. The Church, with its growing influence over daily life, decried these practices as heretical, pagan, or downright subversive. Sacred dances performed around a fire, symbols carved into doorways or etched on stone, the quiet gathering of people in the moonlight to mark the changing of the seasons. These rituals were not just a nuisance to the authorities, they were a challenge to their power, a reminder of the people's connection to something older, something they could not control. In the shadows of night, villagers still performed ceremonies designed to protect their families, their crops, and their communities from the unseen forces of the world. Secret meetings, whispered prayers, and hidden symbols were all part of the tapestry of daily life, passed down from one generation to the next. But these acts of rebellion could not go unnoticed. Authorities investigated unusual symbols, banned gatherings, and punished anyone found participating in what they called pagan practices. The intensity of the persecution suggests just how deeply these rituals were embedded in the culture of the people. To ban them wasn't just about suppressing superstition, it was about suppressing a connection to the past, to a world where the church and political rulers did not hold absolute power. One of the most famous and widespread banned rituals was the green man symbol, often carved into wood and stone. This image of a human face surrounded by leaves and branches represented the spirit of nature itself. To the church, it was a pagan idol, an emblem of the natural world that they sought to suppress in favor of Christian iconography. Villagers who used this symbol, whether in their homes, on their farms, or even in their churches, did so at great personal risk. The church feared that such symbols, though seemingly harmless, could undermine the teachings of Christianity and bring the old ways back to life. Similarly, dances that once celebrated the turning of the seasons, such as the fertility dances of the spring equinox, were outlawed, branded as witchcraft or heretical. These dances, often performed in secluded groves or around bonfires, were deeply communal, connecting people to the cycles of nature and one another. But they also carried a message of rebellion against the rigid structures of authority. To participate in these dances was to reject the domination of the church and to assert one's connection to the earth and to ancient spiritual traditions. What's particularly striking about these practices is that many were not lost by accident, they were actively erased. The church and political authorities understood the power these rituals held over people. They were not just spiritual or cultural acts, they were emotional, personal, and deeply meaningful. To strip away these practices was to strip away a part of the identity of entire communities. In their place, the church offered a different kind of ritual. A ritual that reinforced obedience. A ritual that bound people not to nature, but to a spiritual hierarchy that demanded submission. In the end, many of these rituals vanished from public view, hidden in the shadows or driven underground. But despite the efforts to erase them, they did not disappear entirely. The people who once practiced these rituals continued to hold them close, performing them in secret or passing them down through whispered stories. In the quiet spaces of medieval life, the old ways survived, and the memories of these forbidden practices remained alive. Despite the intense efforts to destroy them, many of the medieval rituals deemed forbidden did not vanish entirely. They adapted, they disguised themselves, and they endured beneath the surface of everyday life. Over time, what was once hidden became woven into the fabric of the more acceptable celebrations, holidays, and customs. The church might have outlawed the dancing, but the rhythms remained. The symbols may have been erased, but their meanings persisted, tucked into the corners of communal life, and ultimately, surviving in ways no one could have predicted. What medieval rituals are you still performing today without even knowing it? One of the most fascinating aspects of these erased rituals is how many of them have survived in plain sight, disguised within the customs and celebrations of modern life. The festivals that once celebrated fire, fertility, and the earth have, in many cases, transformed into the holidays we know today. For example, the tradition of lighting candles in windows during the winter solstice, a practice that once marked the return of the sun and the triumph over darkness, continues in the form of Christmas lights. The same purpose of bringing light into the darkness, of celebrating the return of the sun, persists in these modern customs, even though their deeper, pre-Christian meanings have been largely forgotten. Likewise, the feasts and songs that marked the changing of the seasons have not disappeared, they've simply taken on new forms. The harvest festival, which once involved large communal meals and the honoring of the earth's bounty, has evolved into modern Thanksgiving in many cultures. The songs, once sung around a fire to celebrate nature's abundance, are now the carols and folk songs that still bring communities together during the holiday season. These traditions, although transformed and often stripped of their original meanings, continue to shape our rituals of connection, celebration, and memory. The same is true for many of the symbols that once had deep spiritual significance. The Celtic knot, a symbol of eternal life and the interconnectedness of all things, is still used today, not only in jewelry and artwork, but as a representation of continuity, of cycles unbroken. Similarly, the images of trees and leaves, once representing the sacredness of nature, still appear in modern design and iconography, from logos to tattoos, holding on to their ancient significance even as their origins fade into the background. But it's not just in the larger, public rituals that the echoes of medieval practices remain. In the quiet corners of homes, in the customs passed down through generations, small rituals still persist. How many families, for example, keep a tradition of placing something special on a loved one's grave, a flower, a stone, or an offering, believing it will bring them peace? This simple, personal ritual is a direct link to the medieval belief that the dead were not truly gone, but remained close, needing attention and remembrance. Even everyday gestures, like the way we bless our homes or the ways we ask for good luck, can be traced back to ancient, forbidden practices. Many of these actions were once part of larger, more elaborate rituals that have since been simplified or forgotten, but their essence remains. A protective charm hung over the door, a wish made on a star, a quiet prayer whispered before bed. All are echoes of practices that have survived through the centuries, not as formalized rites, but as small acts of belief, carried on by the people who hold them dear. These survivals, these echoes, show us that the medieval world is not truly gone. It lingers, quietly, beneath the surface of our daily lives, in the words we speak, the rituals we perform, and the symbols we hold dear. What was once suppressed, erased, and hidden has found a way to persist, to survive, and to continue shaping the way we live and understand our world. The power of these forgotten rituals still resides within us, waiting to be recognized, waiting to be remembered. In this chapter, we have explored the hidden world of forbidden practices, rituals that were once erased by those in power, but which have refused to die. From the rituals that were suppressed to the customs that have survived in disguise, the past is never truly gone. It lives on in ways we may not even realize, linking us to a medieval world that still lingers in the small gestures, the shared celebrations, and the symbols that shape our lives today. As we reach the final chapter, we'll reflect on why these forgotten customs matter, and why remembering them is so important in the world we live in now. Throughout history, rituals have played an essential role in the lives of individuals and communities, offering not just a structure for behavior, but also a way of processing emotions, fears, and the uncertainties of life. For the medieval person, rituals weren't simply acts of superstition, they were emotional frameworks designed to provide solace and understanding in a world that often seemed unpredictable and dangerous. From the quiet rituals of the hearth to the grand processions around fire, every tradition had a purpose. They provided a means of making sense of life's inevitable losses, its darkness, and its mysteries. What if the rituals erased from medieval history hold lessons we desperately need now? Today, in our fast-paced, technology-driven world, it's easy to feel disconnected. The rituals that once anchored people, offering a sense of protection and continuity, seem distant, relegated to the past, like forgotten echoes. Modern life, with its relentless push for progress, has largely discarded these practices. We don't gather around the hearth to tell stories anymore. We don't light candles at the doorstep for protection, nor do we mark the passing of seasons with symbolic rites. The ancient rhythms of the earth and the rituals that connected people to them have faded into history. As a result, many of us are left with a sense of emotional fragmentation. We still face fear, grief, and uncertainty, but without the emotional frameworks that once helped guide us through these challenges. In medieval times, rituals provided grounding. They were comforting in their predictability, offering structure and meaning in the face of the unknown. Whether through the lighting of a candle to guide the spirit of a loved one, or the quiet chanting of words before a journey into the wilderness, these rituals gave people something to hold on to when life was unpredictable. They were acts of connection, not just to the divine, but to one another. They reminded individuals that they were not alone, that the collective wisdom of ancestors lived on through these practices. They helped people feel seen, understood, and held. In contrast, modern life often leaves us feeling adrift. We're constantly moving from one task to the next, rarely pausing to reflect or connect with our emotions in a meaningful way. The rituals that once provided emotional grounding are no longer part of the fabric of daily life. This isn't to say that we lack need or desire for meaning. On the contrary, the yearning for connection, protection, and understanding remains deep within us. But without rituals, those emotional anchors, many of us struggle to make sense of the chaos of modern existence. What if we could find a way to integrate the lost rituals of the past into our present lives? What if we could create our own rituals, informed by the ancient traditions that once helped people navigate the complexities of life? These rituals needn't be religious or overtly spiritual. They can simply be practices that allow us to reconnect with the deeper rhythms of the world around us. They could be as simple as taking a moment each day to light a candle, as an act of hope or remembrance, or telling the stories of our lives and families to our children. Just as the medieval world used ritual to navigate their emotional landscapes, perhaps we can look to these practices for guidance in our own. In times of uncertainty, fear, or grief, the rituals of the past provide a gentle reminder that it is not the act itself that is important, but the meaning we assign to it. The emotional framework of ritual, the act of intentionally creating space to reflect, remember, and honor, can help us process our emotions and find meaning in the chaos. The loss of these rituals does not mean we must remain lost. We can rediscover them in our own way, creating emotional connections that are both grounded in history and deeply personal to our modern experience. As we reach the end of this journey through forgotten rituals, it becomes clear that the medieval world is not a distant, separate entity from our own. It is, in many ways, alive within us, woven into the fabric of our daily lives, sometimes in ways we don't even recognize. From the stories we tell around the dinner table to the quiet moments of reflection before we sleep, the spirit of these ancient practices is still with us. What if the medieval world isn't gone at all, but sleeping quietly inside our own? Throughout this documentary, we've explored the forgotten traditions, the secret rites, and the powerful symbols that once defined the medieval experience. We've seen how rituals, from birth to death, were used to give meaning, to protect, and to help individuals and communities make sense of the world. These customs were not just acts of superstition, they were emotional tools, grounding frameworks that helped people navigate the complexities of life. In many ways, they were the original ways people sought connection, protection, and understanding, in a world that felt vast, mysterious, and often terrifying. But even as these rituals faded from the pages of history, their essence lives on. When we pause to light a candle for a loved one, when we gather together to share a meal and tell stories, when we perform an act of kindness or reach out to a stranger in need, we are participating in the same human need for connection, for meaning, and for continuity. These are the echoes of the medieval world, the subtle threads that link us to a time when people sought comfort in the same ways we do today. The rituals of the past were not lost by accident. They were erased, hidden, or transformed by forces that sought to suppress them. Yet, despite the efforts to erase them, these practices could not be completely extinguished. They survived in whispers, in small acts of rebellion, in the quiet rituals performed in the privacy of homes. And over time, they evolved into the customs and practices that still shape our lives today. From seasonal celebrations to the songs we sing, from the ways we mark important milestones to the simple rituals that structure our days, the medieval world is not far behind us, it's within us. As we reflect on these lost rituals, we can find comfort in knowing that they are not truly gone. They live on in our hearts, in our collective memory, and in the ways we still search for understanding and meaning. They remind us that, despite the complexities of modern life, the human need for connection, for ritual, and for a sense of belonging has not changed. Perhaps the greatest gift these rituals offer is not just the solace they provide in times of difficulty, but the reminder that humanity has always sought understanding in the dark. In a world that often feels fragmented, these ancient practices remind us that we are not alone, that the thread of human experience, stretching back through the centuries, continues to bind us together. By acknowledging and embracing these rituals, we not only connect with the past but with one another, creating new traditions that honor the continuity of human life. In the quiet, reflective moments of the night, when the world feels still, we are invited to look inward and consider the rituals that shape our own lives. The rituals that have survived, the ones we still perform without thinking, hold the power to reconnect us with a deeper sense of meaning, grounding us in ways that modern life often fails to do. As we let the echoes of the past resonate within us, we realize that the medieval world is not gone at all. It sleeps quietly within our own hearts, waiting to be remembered, to be acknowledged, and to be carried forward. In closing, this documentary has illuminated the rich, emotional landscape of forgotten rituals. By revisiting these practices and reflecting on their significance, we are reminded that, no matter how much time passes, the need for meaning, connection, and protection remains timeless. The rituals of the medieval world are not lost, they are merely waiting to be rediscovered, to live on within us as we continue the journey of human experience.